Chapter 6 Pony Penning Day. Pony Penning Day always comes on the last Thursday in July. For weeks before, every member of the volunteer fire department is busy getting the grounds in readiness, and the boys are allowed to help. "I'll do your chores at home, Paul," offered Maureen, "so you can see that the pony pens are good and stout." Paul spent long days at the pony penning grounds, yet he could not have told how or by whom the tents were rigged up. He hardly noticed when the chutes for the bronco busting were built. He did not know who pounded the racetrack into condition. All he knew was that the pens for the wild ponies must be made fast. Once the Phantom was captured, she must not escape. Nothing else mattered. The night before the roundup, he and Maureen made last-minute plans in Phantom's stall. "First thing in the morning," Paul told Maureen, "you lay a clean bed of dried seagrass, then fill the manger with plenty of marsh grass to make Phantom feel at home." "Oh, I will, Paul. And I've got some ear corn and some 'lasses to coax her appetite, and Grandma gave me a bunch of tiny new carrots and some rutabagas, and I've been saving up sugar until I have a little sackful." In the midst of their talk, Grandpa, looking as if he had a surprise, joined them. "I hain't rode on a roundup to Assateague for 2 year," he smiled, hiding one hand behind his back. "But I remember we allus had a chaw and a goody after the ponies was rounded up, and afore we swimmed 'em across the channel. Here, Paul," he said with a strange huskiness, "here's a chalk bar for ye to take along," and he pressed the slightly squashed candy into Paul's hand. It was dark and still when Paul awoke the next morning. He lay quiet a moment, trying to gather his wits. Suddenly he shot out of bed. Today was pony penning day. His clothes lay on the chair beside his bed. Hurriedly he pulled on his shirt and pants and thudded barefoot down to the kitchen, where Grandma stood over the stove frying ham and making coffee for him, as if he were a grown man. He flung out his chest, sniffing the rich smells, bursting with excitement. Grandma glanced around proudly. "I picked the first ripe figs of the year just for ye," she exclaimed. "They're chuck full of goodness. Now sit down, Paul, and eat a breakfast fit for a roundup man." Paul sat on the edge of his chair. With one eye on the clock, he tried to eat the delicious figs and ham, but the food seemed a lump in his throat. Luckily, Grandpa and Maureen came downstairs just then and helped clean his plate when Grandma was busy testing her cornbread in the oven with a long wisp of straw. "I gotta go now," Paul swallowed as he ran out the door. He mounted Watch Eyes, a dependable pony that Grandpa had never been able to sell because of his white eyes. Locking his bare feet around the pony's sides, he jogged out of the yard. Maureen came running to see him off. "Whatever happens," Paul called back over his shoulder, "you be at Old Dominion Point at 10 o'clock on a fresh pony." "I'll be there, Paul." "And you, Paul," yelled Grandpa, "obey your leader, no matter what." Day was breaking. A light golden mist came up out of the sea. It touched the prim white houses and the white picket fences with an unearthly light. Paul loped along slowly to save his mount's strength. He studied each house with a new interest. Here lived the woman who paid Maureen $3 for hoeing her potato patch. There lived Kim Horsepepper, the clam digger they had worked for. Mr. Horsepepper was riding out of his lane now, catching up with Paul. All along the road men were turning out of their gates. "Where do you reckon you'll do most good, bub?" taunted a lean sapling of a man who, on other days, was an oysterman. He laughed loudly, then winked at the rest of the group. Paul's hand tightened on the reins. "Reckon I'll do most good where the leader tells me to go," he said, blushing hotly. The day promised to be sultry. The marsh grass that usually billowed and waved stood motionless. The water of Assateague Channel glared like quicksilver. Now the cavalcade was thundering over a small bridge that linked Chincoteague Island to Little Piney Island. At the far end of the bridge, a scow with a rail fence around it stood at anchor. In spite of light talk, the faces of the men were drawn tight with excitement as they led their mounts onto the scow. The horses felt the excitement, too. Their nostrils quivered, and their ears swiveled this way and that, listening to the throb of the motor. Now the scow began to move its way across the narrow channel. Paul watched the white hills of Assateague loom near. He watched the old lighthouse grow sharp and sharper against the sky. In a few minutes, the ride was over. The gangway was being lowered. Split up in 3 bunches, Weil clipped out directions loud and sharp. North, south, and east. Me and Kim and the Beep boy will head east. Wimbro and Quillen goes north. Harvey and Rogers south. We'll all meet at Tom's Point. At the first sound of Weil's steam whistle voice, the seabirds rose with a wild clatter. "They're like scouts," Paul said to himself. "They're going to warn the wild ponies that the enemy has landed." "Giddy up," shouted Weil as he whirled his horse and motioned Kim and Paul to follow. Paul touched his bare heels into Watch Eye's side. They were off. The boy's eyes were fastened on Weil Maddox. He and Kim Horsepepper were following their leader like the wake of a ship. As they rode on, Paul could feel the soft sand give way to the hard meadowland, then to pine-laden trails. There were no paths to follow, only openings to skim through, openings that led to water holes or to grazing grounds. The 3 horses thrashed through underbrush, jumped fallen trees, waded brackish pools, and narrow, winding streams. Suddenly, Paul saw Weil Maddox's horse rear into the air. He heard him neigh loudly as a band of wild ponies darted into an open grazing stretch some 20 yards ahead, then vanished among the black tree trunks. The woods came alive with thundering hoofs and frantic horse calls. Through bush and briar and bog and hard marshland the wild ponies flew. Behind them galloped the 3 riders, whooping at the top of their lungs. For whole seconds at a time the wild band would be swallowed up by the forest gloom. Then it would reappear far ahead, nothing but a flash of flying tails and manes. Suddenly Weil Maddox was waving Paul to ride close. "A straggler," he shouted, pointing off to the left. "He went that-a-way. Get him!" And with a burst of speed, Weil Maddox and Kim Horsepepper were after the band. Paul was alone. His face reddened with anger. They wanted to be rid of him. That's what they wanted. Sent after a straggler. He was not interested in rounding up a straggler that couldn't even keep up with the herd. He wanted Phantom. Then Grandpa's words flashed across his mind. "Obey your leader no matter what." He wheeled his pony and headed blindly into the direction Weil had indicated. He rode deeper into the pine thicket, trying to avoid snapping twigs, yet watching ahead for the slightest motion of leaf or bush. He'd show the men, if it took him all day. His thin shirt clung to him damply, and his body was wet with sweat. A cobweb veiled itself across his face. With one hand he tried to wipe it off, but suddenly he was almost unseated. Watch Eyes was dancing on his hind legs, his nose high in the air. Paul stared into the sun-dappled forest until his eyes burned in his head. At last, far away, and deep in the shadow of the pines, he saw a blur of motion. With the distance that lay between them, it might have been anything, a deer, even a squirrel. Whatever it was, he was after it. Watch Eyes plunged on. There was a kind of glory in pursuit that made Paul and the horse one. They were trailing nothing but swaying bushes. They were giving chase to a mirage. Always it moved on, showing itself only in quivering leaves or moving shadows. What was that? In a clump of myrtle bushes just ahead, Paul reined in. He could scarcely breathe for the wild beating of his heart. There it was again, a silver flash. It looked like mist with the sun on it, and just beyond the mist he caught sight of a long tail of mingled copper and silver. He gazed awestruck. It could be the Phantom's tail, he breathed. It is, in the silver flash. It's not mist, but a brand new colt, too little to keep up with the band. The blood pounded in his ear. No wonder the phantom was a straggler. No wonder she let herself be caught. She's got a baby colt, he murmured. He glanced about him helplessly. If only he could think, how could he drive the phantom and her colt to Tom's Point? Warily he approached the myrtle thicket, then stopped as a hot wave of guilt swept over him. Phantom and her colt did not want to be rounded up by men. He could set them free. No one had brought the phantom in before. No one need ever know. Just then the colt let out a high, frightened whinny. In that little second, Paul knew that he wanted more than anything in the world to keep the mother and the colt together. Shivers of joy raced up and down his spine. His breath came faster. He made a firm resolution. "I'll buy you both," he promised. But how far had he come? Was it 10 miles to Tom's Point or 2? Would it be best to drive them down the beach or through the woods? As if in answer, a loud bugle rang through the woods. It was the Pied Piper, and unmistakably his voice came from the direction of Tom's Point. The phantom pricked her ears. She wheeled round and almost collided with Watch Eyes in her haste to find the band. She wanted the Pied Piper for protection. Behind her trotted the foal, all shining and clean with its newness. Paul laughed weakly. He was not driving the phantom after all. She and her colt were leading him. They were leading him to Tom's Point. Chapter 7. She Can't Turn Back. Tom's Point was a protected piece of land where the marsh was hard and the grasses especially sweet. About 70 wild ponies, exhausted by their morning's run, stood browsing quietly, as if they were in a corral. Only occasionally they looked up at their captors. The good meadow and their own weariness kept them peaceful prisoners. At a watchful distance the round-up men rested their mounts and relaxed. It was like the lull in the midst of a storm. All was quiet on the surface, yet there was an undercurrent of tension. You could tell it in the narrowed eyes of the men, their subdued voices, and their too-easy laughter. Suddenly the laughter stilled. Mouths gaped in disbelief, eyes rounded. For a few seconds no one spoke at all. Then a shout that was half wonder and half admiration went up from all the men. Paul Beebe was bringing in the phantom and a colt. Even the wild herds grew excited. As one horse they stopped grazing, every head jerked high, to see and to smell the newcomers. The Pied Piper whirled out and gathered the mare and colt into his band. He sniffed them all over as if to make sure that nothing had harmed them. Then he snorted at Phantom, as much as to say, "You cause me more trouble than all the rest of my mares put together." The round-up men were swarming around Paul, buzzing with questions. "How'd you do it, Paul?" Wild Maddox called over the excited hubbub. "Where'd you find 'em?" shouted Kim Horsepepper. Paul made no answer. The questions floated round and above him like voices in a dream. He went hot and cold by turns. Did he do the right thing by bringing the phantom and her foal in? Miserably he watched the phantom's head droop. There was no wild sweep to her mane and tail now. The free wild thing was caught like a butterfly in a net. She was webbed in by men, yelling and laughing. "Well, this beats all," he heard someone say. "For 2 years we've been trying to round up the phantom, and along comes a spindling youngster to show us up." "It was the colt that hindered her." "Of course it was. It's the newest colt in the bunch. It may not be able to take the swim. If we lose only one colt, it'll still be a good day's work. Jumpin' Jupiter, boy, it's hot." The men accepted Paul as one of them now, a real round-up man. They were clapping him on the shoulder and offering him candy bars. Suddenly he remembered that Grandpa had pressed one into his hand. He took off the wrapper and ate, not because he was hungry, but because he wanted to seem like one of the men. They were trying to get him to talk. "Ain't they a shaggy-looking bunch?" Kim Horsepepper asked. "Except for Misty," Paul said, pointing to the Phantom's coat. "Her coat is silky." The mere thought of touching it sent shivers through him. Misty, he thought to himself wonderingly. Why, I've named her. The little foal was nursing greedily. Paul's eyes never strayed from the two of them. It was as if they might disappear into the mist of the morning, leaving only the sorrels and bays and blacks behind. Only once he looked out across the water. 2 lines of boats were forming a ponyway across the channel. He saw the cluster of people and mounts waiting on the shores of Chincoteague, and he knew that somewhere among them was Marine. It was like a relay race. Soon she would carry on. "Could I swim my mount across the channel, alongside the Phantom?" Paul asked Wild Maddox anxiously. Wild shook his head. "Watch Eyes is all tuckered out. Besides, there's a kind of tradition in the way things is handled on pony penning day. There's mounted men for the roundup, and there's boatmen to herd 'em across the channel." "Tide's out," he called in clipped tones. "Current is slack. Time for the ponies to be swimmed across. Let's go." Suddenly the beach was wild with commotion. From 3 sides the roundup men came rushing at the ponies, their hoarse cries whipping the animals into action. They plunged into the water, the stallions leading, the mares following, neighing encouragement to their colts. "They're off," shouted Wild Maddox, and everyone felt the relief and triumph in his words. Kim thumped Paul on the back as they boarded the scow for the ride back. "Don't fret about your prize. You've got the Phantom sure this time. Once in the water, she can't turn back." But he was wrong. Chapter 8. Caught in the Whirlpool. On the shores of Chincoteague, the people pressed forward, their faces strained to stiffness, as they watched the Assateague beach. "Here they come!" the cry broke out from every throat. Maureen, wedged in between Grandpa Beebe on one side and a volunteer fireman on the other, stood on her mount's back. Her arms paddled the air as if she were swimming and struggling with the wild ponies. Suddenly, a fisherman, looking through his binoculars, began shouting in a hoarse voice, "A newborn colt is afeard to swim. It's knee-deep in the water and won't go no further." The crowds yelled their advice. "What's the matter with the roundup men? Why don't they just heft it into the deep water? It'll swim all right. Why don't they just lift it up on the boat?" The fisherman was trying to get a better view. He was crawling out over the water on a wall of piling. It seemed a long time before he put his binoculars to his eyes again. The people waited breathlessly. A small boy began crying. "Shh," quieted his mother. "Listen to the man with the 4 eyes." "The colt's too little to swim," the fisherman yelled. "Wait, a wild pony is breaking out from the mob, swimming around the mob, escaping." An odd murmur stirred the crowds. Maureen dug her toes into her mount's back. She strained her eyes to see the fugitive, but all she could make out was a milling mass of dark blobs on the water. The fisherman leaned far out over the water. He made a megaphone of one hand. "Them addle-brained boatmen can't stop the pony," his voice rasped. "It's outsmarting 'em all." Maureen's mind raced back to the other pony pennings. The Phantom upsetting a boat. The Phantom fleeing through the woods, always escaping, always free. She clutched the neck of her blouse. She felt gaspy, like a fish flapping about on dry land. Why was the man with the binoculars so slow? Why didn't he say, "It's the Phantom"? Who else could it be? Now he was waving one arm wildly. He looked like a straw in the wind. He teetered He lost his balance. He almost fell into the water in his excitement. "It's the Phantom," he screamed at last. "I can see the white map on her shoulders." The people took up the cry, echoing it over and over. "It's the Phantom. She's escaped again." Maureen felt tears on her cheek and impatiently brushed them away. Again the fisherman was waving for quiet. "Hush," bellowed Grandpa Beebe. The people fell silent. They were like listeners around a microphone. "It's the Phantom's colt that won't swim," he called out in a voice so hoarse it cracked. "The Phantom got separated from a brand-fire new colt. She's gone back to get it." The people whooped and hollered at the news. "The Phantom's got a colt." Again the fisherman was waving for silence. "She's reached her colt, but the roundup men are closing in on her. They're making her shove the colt into the water. She's making it swim." Grandpa Beebe cupped his hands around his mouth. "Can the little feller make it?" he boomed. The crowd stilled, waiting for the hoarse voice. For long seconds no answer came. The fisherman remained as fixed as the piling he stood on. Wave after wave of fear swept over Maureen. She felt as if she were drowning. And just when she could stand the silence no longer, the fisherman began reporting in short, nervous sentences. "There, halfway across, jumping Jupiter, the colt. It's being sucked down in a whirlpool. I can see it now. Soul and body. A boy's jumped off the boat. He's swimming out to help the colt." The onlookers did not need the fishermen with the binoculars anymore. They could see for themselves. A boy swimming against the current. A boy holding the colt's head above the swirling water. Maureen gulped great lungfuls of air. "It's Paul!" she screamed. "It's Paul!" On all sides the shouts went up. "Why, it's Paul!" "Paul Beebe!" Grandpa leaped up on his mount's back as nimbly as a boy. He stood with his arms upraised, his fist clenched. "God help ye, Paul," his words carried out over the water. "You're almost home." Grandpa's voice was as strong as a tow rope. Paul was swimming steadily toward it, holding the small silver face of the colt above the water. He was almost there. He was there. Maureen slid down from her mount, clutching a handful of mane. "You made it, Paul. You made it," she cried. The air was wild with whinnies and snorts as the ponies touched the hard sand, then scrambled up the shore, their wet bodies gleaming in the sun. Paul half carried the little colt up the steep bank, then suddenly it found its own legs. Shouts between triumph and relief escaped every throat as the little filly tottered up the bank. Almost at the top, her feet went scooting out from under her, and she was down on the sand, her sides heaving. Maureen felt a new stab of fear. If only the big ponies would not crush her, that tender little white body among all those thrashing hoofs. What chance did she have? What chance with the wild wind as a mother? But all the wildness seemed to have ebbed out of the Phantom. She picked her 4 feet high. Then she carefully straddled her colt and fenced in the small white body with her own slender legs. For a brief second, Paul and Maureen's eyes met over the crowds. It was as if they and the mare and her foal were the only creatures on the island. They were unaware of the great jostling and fighting as the stallions sorted out their own mares and colts. They were unaware of everything but a sharp ecstasy. Soon the Phantom and her colt would belong to them, never to be sold. The Pied Piper wheeled around Paul. He peered at the dripping boy from under his matted forelock. Then he trumpeted as if to say, "This sopping wet creature is no mare of mine." And he pushed Paul out of the way while the crowds laughed hysterically. Dodging horses and people, Grandpa Beebe made his way over to Paul. "Paul boy," he said, his voice unsteady, "I swimmed the whole way with you. You're the most wonderful and craziest young'un in the world. Now get home right smart quick," he added, trying to sound stern. "You're about done up, and Grandma's expecting ye. Maureen and I'll see that the Phantom and her colt reach the pony pens."